Here we are. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to That GD Show. How many of you tuned in 2 hours ago thinking the show was at the old time?
I almost did, so
Did
I
you?
wouldn't blame anybody else. Yeah.
No, I tell you, I found myself kind of, what do I do with myself now for these 2 hours? I'm so used to logging in about 6:30 and going on at 7.
No,
So, yeah.
I just had that moment where it's kind of like when it's the weekend and you wake up in a panic because you think that you're late for work and then you remember it's Saturday. It was like that. I was like, oh, shit, like I'm so late for the show. Oh,
well,
never mind.
Welcome to all you West Coast people who are now able to tune in live. We announced it a couple weeks ago that we were making a time switch, and most of the feedback has been very positive. Some of the folks that live in UK and other places are finding it more challenging, but we knew that it just was too early for a lot of people in the Pacific time zone and the Mountain time zone, and even the Central. I mean, it's 6 o'clock is early. So anyway, this is our new time. We're glad to have everyone here. Welcome back, Genevieve. It seems like forever, but you were gone a couple weeks ago. I was gone, so it's odd when we're not on together anymore.
I know, but it makes the time that we are on together feel like that much more of a treat, which I guess is somewhat appropriate to the conversations that we'll be having tonight.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to bring our guest on in a minute, but before that, I want to make a couple of announcements. First of all, like and subscribe if you haven't. If you're new here, subscribe to this channel. It is objectively the best show on the internet today. I don't think there's any question about that in most people's minds.
Objectively.
Yes, of course not.
Yeah.
But there's Anton Gomez.
Anton.
14 Mexican dollars. Hello, Anton. Thank you for that super sticker. We appreciate your support. As always, there's our Greg Markowski, 1999, like clockwork, my man. You know what? You let Anton beat you this week, though. You're usually the first one here. We really appreciate y'all's support. It really does help us keep the lights on. It does cost some money to put the show on with the call-in studio and so forth. And by the way, that is a call-in show. And Genevieve, how can folks call in tonight?
You can just call the same number as always. It is 217-375-9933. It's 217-375-WWDD.
That's what would Dave do. He would call in is what he would do.
Yeah.
So you're going to want to call in and talk to our guest tonight or talk to us. If you got questions or comments, you can't always put them in the chat. We'll try to catch them. Sometimes the chat gets a little bit hectic, so we might miss it. But oftentimes our great producer, Ethan, catches it for us. Another announcement we made last week that I want to remind us of. This is the beginning of our trivia contest that we're going to do each week to give away a GD Show coffee mug. Let's have a look at that. Look at that coffee mug. Here's how you can win one this week. There will be a trivia question from my book, That Childish Things, my memoir. I started to say That Childish Things. That's not the name of it. Childish Things, my memoir. It's been out a few months now. Getting really good feedback on it. If you haven't gotten one, I encourage you to get a copy. I'm really happy with how it came out. But what we're going to do each week is I'm going to ask a question, a trivia question that there's no way you would know from watching shows, or even if you knew me personally, you wouldn't know these details unless you read it in the book. So you're going to have to have read the book, or if you haven't, get one and be ready for the trivia contest, because you're going to want one of these coffee mugs. I missed a chat. Who was that? Help me. Bill Castle. Hello, Bill. Thank you for that $10 super sticker. So later in the show, not the very end, but later. So we encourage you to stick around. We will be asking the trivia question, and the first one who answers in the chat the correct answer will win the mug for the week, and then you can email me and give me your details and things like that, and you'll have a coffee mug. Is that okay?
I will resist the urge to just chime in with the answer because I am on top of my shit and I did read Dave's book. And if you haven't, then you should be more like me and do it. It's great.
I bet you might not even know these answers, because I asked Bevan the question tonight and she said, "Oh, I don't know that." So this is a really deep dive.
Ooh,
yeah.
Wow.
This is gonna,
okay.
This
If Bevan
is a little,
didn't get it, I am not.
This is a little trivia detail that you'll have to, and there'll be some people skimming their books during the show. I'm having a feeling.
Yeah.
So enough of this chit chat. Thank you again. If you like and subscribe. Also, I need to mention Patreon. That's a big help for us in our support to help us do what we're doing with the Dying Out Loud work that we do. If you can become a Patreon supporter, that's very much appreciated, and we love you and thank you for that. So let's bring our guest on, Dr. Hector Garcia. There he is. Yay. Hello, Hector.
Hey, guys.
Good to see you, man.
Good to see
Hector's
you both.
Coming to us from San Antonio. Is that where you are right now?
That's where I'm at, San Antonio.
I didn't know you were on the road. And Hector, you and I met several months ago. We had known each other a while, but hadn't met personally until October, Faithless Forum.
Yeah, that is where we met in person.
Yeah. I was wandering the hall and I looked up and there you were. And I thought, Hector, my man. And then we saw each other again a few weeks ago at the American Atheist Conference in Atlanta.
Yeah, so, we FaceTimed before that.
Yeah, we did that. So we've had some connection, but I'm really been looking forward. We've been trying to get you on for a while now. We just had some scheduling conflicts. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. If you guys have any questions as we dive into some of these topics tonight, just please give us a call or jump on the chat, and we'll be sure and try to get your question in here. But we want to talk on several issues. We titled it tonight, How the Alpha God Protects Us from Death. A little bit of a provocative title, but you and I talked about it a little bit, Hector. So take that title and give us a summary of what that means and what we're going to be talking about tonight, if you would.
Well, that topic comes from my first book, Alpha God.
Yeah.
And the subtitle is The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression. And so the overarching premise is that we have spent so much of our evolution as a species as social primates living in social dominance hierarchies that we've developed psychological adaptations for navigating those hierarchies. And with them, we project the rules of dominance and submission into our myths and into our mythological beings. So as we see in religions across the world, we have gods who are male, who are intensely interested in things like territory, our sexual behaviors, submission displays, things that omnipotent, everlasting, immaterial beings should have no interest in, unless, of course, they were projections of our own primate psychology.
Are you saying that man has created these gods, Hector?
I wouldn't be the first, but I'm expanding on what that look.
That's blasphemy, brother.
There's a section on blasphemy as well.
Yeah. And just so our audience knows, this is not, you're not some PhD guy. You're a psychologist. So this is your area of expertise, the psychological ramifications of this God that we've created and why we did it and those kind of things, right?
I am a psychologist. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So along with that is that we seek out protection from these figures, not just the Abrahamic God, but from gods, across the world's religions. And I think what's special for us human beings is that we are unique in that we have a profound sense of self. We know that we exist. And, as far as we can tell on a level, way greater than any other animal. We also have the ability to project ourselves into the future. That look holds with it an awareness of our own annihilation.
Mm-hmm.
And that is uniquely terrifying. So we in turn avoid that terror with all kinds of psychological defenses. And that premise is the basis of what is known as terror management theory.
Yeah.
So terror management theory researchers study the impulses and thoughts of subjects presented with their fear of death, which they experimentally prime in the research lab by a procedure they call mortality salience induction. And it's kind of a brilliant technique. So what they do is they will have experimental groups write about death, often their own death, and control groups write about something innocuous like television or food or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And once that mortality salience is induced in that way, you can measure all kinds of things. And so what we the scientific community find is that once that fear of death is induced, people will endorse greater belief in God. They will endorse greater belief in the afterlife, greater religiosity overall. They're more likely to favor their in-group. They're more likely to be tribalistic. All kinds of things happen. But one interesting turn is that people will tend to huddle around political leaders. So one study, for example, during George Bush's presidency found that subjects who had this fear of death induced experimentally significantly increased their support for Bush and for his anti-terrorism policies, irrespective of their political orientation. So this pool is old. We naturally have a tendency to be drawn towards those things that provide a sense of protection. And our draw is to powerful male figures. This is ancient. And just really because of the fact that among primates, males tend to have larger canines. They tend to be bigger. They tend to be more aggressive. And across our history, they tend to be the ones that in the group that warded off predators or even the rival group. So research finds, for example, that we prefer taller leaders. We prefer leaders with more masculine facial features like wider jaws, and that we even prefer this in our female leaders. So this preference exists across cultures. So with the hardware that was forged by the evolutionary pressures of predators and outside groups, we create these supernatural male beings that are tasked with providing protection against outsiders. And we see this across the world's religions.
Yeah. Does this somewhat explain Donald Trump coming in on the scene as this bravado, tough-talking male figure that somehow galvanized does it explain him, this psychological alpha male thing?
Oh, who could deny that he emits a certain chimpanzee aroma about him? I mean, absolutely. And he often accentuated his size relative to his competitors. Little Marco Rubio, little Rocket Man. He would refer to his political adversaries as little, and he'd accentuate how big he is. It's very primitive stuff.
Yeah.
Mike Pence went on the campaign trail, kept saying, he's a broad-shouldered leader, broad shoulders. He would say that at every stop. Well, broad shoulders has been found in the research lab to be associated with fighting prowess. So when we see people with broad shoulders, we respect them. It's this ancient pull towards large male leaders. But, the question is, would a modern day president ever get our back in a real fight? Does that really matter today? It really doesn't, practically speaking, but it matters psychologically to us. So great question.
Love it. Will Judy, our friend in Houston, we were there last week. He was a great host. 1999 super chat. I love it when adults converse. Taking notes on social psychology to use in my activism. And there's Kim Possible, our Antichrist donation, $6.66 every week. Love and support to you, Dave, Genevieve, and guests. Thank you for what you do. So, Genevieve, your thoughts on this alpha male, as a female here, this alpha male ideology that's prevalent in this culture that we're living in?
I mean, I have so many thoughts. First, I want to shout out the spotted hyena, which flips the scripts when it comes to gendered dynamics. But it's funny because, thinking of the example of Donald Trump, I've heard it said before that he is like a weak man's idea of a strong man, or a dumb person's idea of a smart man. I've heard, variations on those sort of, pithy talking points before. But going slightly beyond that, thinking about how, the broad shoulders from Mike Pence, and the way that Donald Trump would react if you ever discussed like the size of his relatively small hands, it seems like despite our like primate monkey brains that do gravitate towards this protector, we can still sort of, in some ways, differentiate when somebody is sort of trying to play to those emotions. Like, how is it that we can see that some people gravitate towards these sort of like baseline, shows of power and bravado, and then another large portion of the population can look at this and see like, oh, this is clearly a facade. I guess a similar question would be, how is it that people can en masse gravitate towards a horrific figure like, Yahweh in the Bible, and then many others could look at this and see that it's blatantly obvious that this is a creation of man, this big jealous figure who mauls children with bears and kills millions of people?
Yeah, big question. Let me see if I can. They're
long
great.
one.
They're great questions. Let me see if I can parse those apart and answer them. Well, first of all, half the U.S. population did see that, right? The other half apparently did not.
A little more than half, to be clear.
A little more than
Yeah.
half, to be precise.
Twice.
But, there's an old quip in psychology that narcissists see themselves as a piece of shit at the center of the universe. They see themselves as the center of the universe, but deep down, it's a false sense of grandiosity, right? I mean, their self-esteem is damaged, and everything around that is compensatory. And I think a lot of us can see through that.
Yeah.
So I seek to answer that question in my second book, which is called Sex, Power, and Partisanship. And one of the things that we find is that people vary on the natural curve in terms of fear sensitivity. So you remember the natural curve from high school biology, it's kind of shaped like a bell. So let's take fear sensitivity, for example. Some people have a lot of fears to a wide variety of stimuli, and most of us are kind of in between, and others hardly fear anything at all. Well, when we use where people fall on that continuum to predict political orientation, it predicts political conservatism and political liberalism almost to a T. So the more fearful you are, the more likely you are going to be drawn to conservative politics, and vice versa for being politically liberal, including fear of outsiders, and especially fear of outsiders, fear of the outside tribe. And that's simply because the outside tribe was such a threat for such a long history in our species history, that we develop mechanisms to be, suspicious of outsiders. But that is a fatal flaw among that segment of the population, because fear makes us more manipulable. And there's research looking into this. Fear disrupts cortical functioning, and you have these really old brain structures that just fire and fill our bodies full of adrenaline and cortisol. And you can't think very clearly when you're fearful. And so this is one of the reasons I like to talk about evolutionary psychology so much, is because if you don't understand your evolved psychology, other people who know it are going to manipulate it. And certainly the media does, certainly these big political interests do, certainly political campaigns understand, their population. So that's part of it.
Well, how does this play into, I mean, you talk about alpha God, and, we know what the alpha male looks like, the dominant figure in a tribe or a group of people. When you say alpha God, that is indicative of this God that's created by the alpha males in a particular subspecies or subgroup. Is that kind of where you go with that? And then the idea that this alpha God's goal is to dominate, to control, to well, we see it in the God of the Bible, right? David Paul, thank you. $1.99, thank you.
We see it through the God of the Bible. We see that role of protector across the world's religions. The Egyptian god Bes, for example, that's Bes's primary job was to protect women and children. The Greek god Zeus protected the Greek cities from these monsters that were attacking it. The God of the Bible is said to protect against lions and wild dogs and bears, animals that were literally found on the African savanna. But also with the not only protection from death by predation, but protection from death itself with the afterlife.
Yeah.
So that's huge. And it's no coincidence, I argue, that role has been tasked to a big male figure. But again, that leaves us vulnerable. That promise of protection leaves us vulnerable to manipulation, because there really is no dominant male in the ether. What happens is dominant men on earth puppeteer that God, and they puppeteer that God, saying, hey, I have a special alliance with this God. And typically what they say that God wants is in line with their own interests and their own evolutionary interests, right? Send us money, send us your women, send us your wealth. I mean, how many evangelicals have made millions and millions of dollars by promising salvation?
Mm-hmm. Promising prosperity, and really it's a promising of protection against whatever it is that people are afraid of, whether it's a fear of lack, a fear of death, a fear of any number of things that could be plaguing their psyche. I want to deal. Don't let me forget this. I want to come back to it because I want your take as a psychologist on the conspiracy theories, QAnon, the things like that people fall prey to, and the kind of people that fall prey to them. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole just yet, because we may not come back out of it.
I was gonna say, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that was going to be my other question.
Good.
Yeah.
I want to see how that ties into the alpha thinking and the protection thinking. But before that, I want to talk about death. It's something you and I have talked about offline. We've talked about it in person. You've mentioned to me the things I've been talking about for the last 3 years, and go there for us tonight. What is it that has struck you about that?
Oh boy. Well, gosh, I have been moved by some of your talks. I saw this thing that you did with Seth Andrews, and I was just, the way you expressed why you were doing all this, it just it was so moving, Dave. I just thought, man, I got to get on your show and talk to you and Genevieve and even share some of my own story, because look, a lot of people tell their personal stories for different reasons. Some people tell it for attention, some people tell it for shock value. But you're telling your story to help people, and I like that. And so I think, one of the things about believing in an afterlife is that you can neglect your time here on earth. That's incredibly limited.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that realization about life's temporal, and this is going to end, that can have tremendous therapeutic value.
Mm-hmm.
And we're all not going to survive life.
We're all terminal. Yeah.
We're all terminal.
Yeah.
And it's
my clock's out on the table, but everybody's got a clock. And yeah, so, and everyone, knows my story and what I talk about, so I don't want to belabor it here. But that is a core part of the message of Dying Out Loud is that the infatuation with the afterlife, a fetish, I called it, a fetish for the afterlife, causes us by default to minimize this life and to miss what's here, because you can't focus on two things at once. You're going to do disservice to one or the other. But as soon as you make peace with the knowledge that this is it, this is all we have, then you're going to be able to focus more on what are you going to do with that now? How are you going to make that count?
And it's difficult to arrive at that eagle eye perspective on the life cycle, because, you know, in many ways our brains weren't really adapted for that. They were adapted to solve problems of survival in the here and now, you know, and it's hard to make that look, you know. Sometimes you can get that through psychotherapy. I just ended a 17-year career working with vets with PTSD, and some of these guys, you know, Vietnam vets, I'd start seeing them in their 70s, and with PTSD, right? And so we have these amazing treatments that work, and these guys would have this realization: wow, I am seeing now that I can, whatever years I have left, I can live them in a different way, and that's powerful. Even though they may have burned 50 years with this disorder and self-medicating that disorder with alcohol or avoidance or whatever it is, but sometimes, you know, it takes psychotherapy. Sometimes it takes listening to somebody like you, and that's why I like what you're doing, you know, because you can take somebody else's look into the void that's coming up quickly and learn from it. And I hope people do, and that's why I wanted to come talk to you.
Thanks, man. No, but we've been really wanting to get together. The denial of death, the idea that religion was created by man. I mean, this is a gross generalization, but man created religion and a narrative about life and death to protect themselves from the inevitability of death or the finiteness of this life. Talk to us about that and what your studies and your writings around that subject.
Well, I mean, like we talked about, I mean, it's such a profoundly bizarre position to be in, because we understand ourselves. We are aware of ourselves in this way that's just, it's really remarkable. You know, it's really special that we know that we have a self, you know?
Yeah.
But we also know it's going to go at some point, and it's terrifying. It's terrifying. You know, that's, I think that is probably the primary reason that religions were created, because what religion doesn't promise an afterlife. You know, you see it across the world of religions. The ancient Egyptians had the fields of Aru. The ancient Greeks and Romans had the underworld. The Hopi tribe had the land of the dead. Muslims have paradise. I mean, it's just on and on and on. And the interesting thing is that all of these safe territories are administered by powerful males. In the mythology, because
they control the gate. They're the gatekeeper, right?
They're the gatekeeper. You follow them, that's where you go, to the safe lands, you know. And I think that just speaks to what we are, you know. And it infuses so much of our psychology, so much of our religions, and a lot of different aspects of daily living.
And, you know, kind of going back to the initial study that you sort of mentioned about when people were artificially faced with their own mortality, how did they sort of change when it came to their fear response? And I guess my question is there a difference that you have noticed when it comes to these sort of existential crises or these, you know, this, I guess, tendency for people to gravitate towards these alpha males and this promise of an afterlife? Is there a difference between people for whom this idea is completely abstract versus for people like Dave, who face their mortality in a very like visceral, real way? Or people like myself who have faced, direct, difficult loss.
Yeah. Are there differences? Yeah, I think so. I think it's the more fearful among us are going to be more likely to take that turn, because that promise of protection is a salve against the terror of annihilation. I think people who think very rigidly, and even people who aren't terribly, that's a hard turn to make. That is a hard turn for humanity to make. And in that sense, I can understand why people would gravitate towards religion, because otherwise, life can be, hard suffered if that impending end is always in the forefront of your mind. So we distract ourselves with these promises, and I think a lot of people probably do so, but deep down, they don't really believe it. Maybe they make Pascal's wager. Maybe they really don't believe it at all.
That's the thing I've found, is that the people that I've talked to in the last 3.5 years doing this work, the Christians seem to be more uncomfortable with death, even afraid of it, than the atheists. And that's been a very puzzling thing for me. And the only conclusion I can come to, maybe you could speak to that, Hector, but maybe they don't really believe it. Maybe they wonder, because there is this sense of an afterlife and a judgment and rewards and punishment, and these ideas that they've floated throughout their lives. And maybe there's this sense of, what if I got it wrong? Or what if I didn't choose the right God? Or what if I'm not right with that God? What if he's angrier with me than I thought he was? All of these questions that may bubble just below the surface. Whereas an atheist like myself, there's none of those questions. There's just, when it's over, it's over. And there's no judgment seat of Christ. There's no white throne. There's no punishment or reward. It's a simpler way to look at life and death. What do you think?
I do think it's a simpler way to look at life and death. I think it's freeing. It's intellectual liberation. It can be terrifying, but it's honest. I'd rather be honest. I'd rather be honest and feel that discomfort and reconcile that than self-deceive. But we humans are incredibly adept at self-deception. That's another part.
Yeah, we want to see, we want to see my dad on the other side, or grandma, but why? Why are we uncomfortable with this being all there is? Why is this not enough? What is there in us that makes it that makes that an uneasy thing to wrestle with?
Yeah, our big egos, an ego in the sense that, again, the conscious part of our brain that knows that we exist. And I think a certain portion of that is just instinctual, right? It would
like
make
self-preservation.
Self-preservation.
Yeah. And that's evolutionary.
Absolutely. I mean, the animals who didn't fear death would weed themselves out of the gene pool pretty quickly.
But we have a consciousness that other animals don't have. So I'm just wondering how, because I've been asked dozens of times, are you, what do you think happens after we die? Are you afraid of dying? These kind of questions. And are you upset that you're dying? And I guess I've distilled my answer down to this idea that, why isn't this life enough? I mean, we're conscious enough to know that when we go to a movie, we know it's going to end. When we eat a meal, we know it's going to end. We know there's going to be that last bite. You're not going to sit and eat a meal for eternity. You're not going to watch an eternal movie. I did watch, the first time I saw Lord of the Rings, I thought, my God, is this movie ever going to end? And it didn't end. It just stopped and said, okay, now part 2 is coming. I was so pissed off. I hated that movie. I'm sorry.
Dave,
yeah, I did.
We are talking about this offline. I saw each one 6 times in theaters. I was upset.
I don't care.
I understand what you're saying. In fact,
hire a fucking editor, movie maker, please.
Well, I have a funny story about that.
But the point is, we're conscious of these things ending, and why aren't we able to be conscious that this life is going to end, and I'm okay with that because my goal is to get as much out of it as I can, not to make it last as long as I can. Why aren't we comfortable with that? What's the psychology behind that?
I'm not only here to pontificate, I'm here to learn from you, maestro. You tell me.
No,
That's a great question. I'm sure you've wrestled with that, and
I have.
I think it's beautiful to arrive at that understanding. Like,
Well, I'm
make
not
the
saying
here
I've
and now
arrived.
matter. I mean, I try to live my life that way. I've certainly
Yeah.
come to that realization in my own journey.
Yeah, I'm not saying I've arrived. I do have, I mean, as my body declines, I become more aware that the end is near. I mean, when I got diagnosed, I realized, okay, yeah, this is it. I mean, this is the thing that's going to kill me.
Yeah.
And so that awareness became front and center. But as I realized pretty quickly, my decline was very slow, and I was able to then put off the reality, basically to live in denial. Bevan and I talk all the time that we both live in denial. You kind of have to. You can't wake up every morning and say, okay, I'm a day closer to dying. That's
Right.
that's a horrible mindset to go through the day with.
Right.
But as my body deteriorates, I'm more aware that this thing is coming. And so I have my moments when I think, this is really going to happen. This is really going to happen. And I can see the end closer than I could before. And I'm gripped again with the reality that I don't want it to end. I want the good moments that I can get, the people that I see, and the times that I have. I want those to go on, and life with Bevan and all the things that make life enjoyable. But it's at the same time, I'm okay with it ending, because I don't think anything that has value doesn't have an end. The finiteness makes it more valuable, if you will. So that's the struggle we all face, I think.
Yeah. And I think normalizing that both are true. I mean, you don't want it to end, but you accept it. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. That probably happens with everybody when they get to the end of their walk.
Yeah.
But the thing is, we don't talk about death enough in this society. That's something that you and I talked about. This anthropologist, Ernest Becker, who wrote this book called Denial of Death.
Right.
We're so insulated from death.
I'm trying to fix that.
You are trying to fix that. And I told you, I promised that we'd talk a little bit about Peyote Church, which was my only religious experience. But before we do that, I mean, just taking a look at the culture we live in, we're all about achievement and building these edifices of human accomplishment that seem to protect us from, the fact that everything, we're going to decay. Just think of how we bury our dead. I was talking to, when my grandfather was alive, I talked to him about how we would bury dead in the old days.
Yeah.
Men would dig a grave by hand. They'd get their hands in it. The family would prepare the body. The family would clean the body, dress the body, do whatever, rituals they did. And the men would dig the hole, and so that the women could get their hands in it, they'd come by with a handful of earth and put it in the grave, so they could have their hands in it. It's so they can see
they
that
were involved in it. They were personally invested. Yeah.
And here we take our loved ones to a mortuary, and somebody we aren't related to make our bodies up with makeup and all kinds of stuff to where it looks like we're not even dead. It hides the reality of it. And then some dude with a backhoe comes in and buries it without us being there to see. That's denial. That's denial of that part of the life cycle. And I think it makes us especially afraid of death, because we just isolate ourselves from it for so much
You
of our
can
lives.
dissociate from that whole process very
Yeah.
easily. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I wonder what the practice of embalming really says about us as a society. I've always found the idea of the funeral industry when it comes to really, really fancy, expensive caskets for our loved ones, and then literally replacing their bodily fluids with other fluids that will preserve them, kind of ironic. Because what I do find comforting and beautiful about death is its sort of necessary requirement for life itself. It's that when you decay, you are giving nutrients back to the earth for everything else to enjoy.
Yeah, the
And I
cycle
think
of life.
and it's interesting when I think about the crisis that we're facing with soil erosion and nutrient depletion and climate change, and then with our own bodies we're so uncomfortable with death, it seems, that we do everything we can to protect death from the part of it that gives life, if that makes sense. It's just bizarre.
Absolutely. And we take ourselves out of the process. I think, to me, as somebody who I wasn't raised religious, I wasn't raised as a Catholic like the rest of my giant Mexican American family was, and somebody who's really spent a lot of time contemplating our biology. To me, being part of that system of life is being something bigger than ourselves. It's comforting in a sense,
Before we go down the little rabbit hole I wanted to go down earlier, Genevieve, I want you to think about your question for Hector about the psychology behind the QAnon or conspiracy theory ideology. I want to speak to a specific example of something I just learned a couple of days ago. But we're going to pause and do the trivia question right now. So get your Bibles out. I mean, your Book of Dave out, Book of Dave, and turn to, no, I'm just kidding. So this is a deep dive trivia, and the first one who gets the answer in the chat will get the coffee mug. So Metalhead just showed up. What did I miss? We're doing a trivia question from my book, Childish Things, which I think everyone can agree is the best book ever written, except Hector's. And so I'm just kidding.
Maybe J.R.R. Tolkien.
It is pretty good, though. Yeah, the Tolkien wrote a pretty good book, but they made a bad movie out of it. But I'm not letting up on that, Genevieve. So here's the question. As a young Christian, baby Christian, I called myself, I worked in a construction company, and I was sent to Utah to work during the winter. And I worked there for a good number of weeks. And I was afraid of going there because I felt like my faith was fragile, and I was afraid that I would be tempted or something would happen. I was just afraid. I didn't want to go. What town in Utah did I go to? Genevieve's thinking, I don't know that.
No, that's so cruel.
It's not cruel.
Goodness.
So you grab your copy and go find the chapter you think that might be appropriate. What town in Utah did I go to work construction and engage with the Mormons? There's you a hint. So first one to get the answer in the chat, we'll get information from you on where to send your GD Show coffee mug. Okay.
I like all the comments saying Provo, because if I remember correctly, it was a little more rural than that.
Oh, Ethan said, "What's the answer so I can look for the winner?" Hang on.
Oh.
I gotta tell him that. What'd they say in the comments?
I see Provo. I see 2 Provos. Toy Ranch, I'll give you the typo. That's fine.
That's a good guess. That's a guess.
Yeah.
Those are good guesses.
Salt Lake City, it was a small town. I don't know the town. I don't know the answer to this question, but
okay,
I do remember
good guesses there.
You were
if
staying
you see
at a
the
motel, and there
Ethan's
was
looking,
a little church across the street.
That's right.
And you found your little family at this church that was so sad that
the story.
Congregation was dying out because there was nobody there. So it's not Salt Lake City. There are people in Salt Lake City.
Small town. Nope. The guesses are coming in, but so far, No one yet. Keep trying. Ethan's looking for the answer, so I gave him the answer in the private chat.
I'm sorry. I saw West Bumblefuck and I just giggled.
Yeah. We're trying to get too distracted on that. So
anyway.
I had a friend of mine just recently is writing some stuff in her blog about her family getting sucked in by QAnon. And she comes from a second, and when you think of QAnon, you think of right-wing Christian nut jobs, right? This family was liberal, educated, atheist, raised the kids, her and her brother, to be question everything, to look for evidence. They were educated. They've traveled to many countries. They've lived in other countries. And yet, in the last month or 2 or 3, maybe longer than that, they've gone full on QAnon. I mean, she posted an email that she got from her mom and dad, and it just, you can't believe. I mean, every batshit crazy QAnon conspiracy theory idea that you can think of, her parents have bought into. What the hell? How do you explain this, Hector? What is the psychology behind that kind of thing happening?
Yeah. This is where I think the evolutionary sciences are just do such a good job of describing the ultimate reason for these kind of things. And actually, I've got this book project. I don't know if I'll ever do anything with it. It's a bit of a memoir. It may just be a diary that I keep for myself, or I may just say, okay, let's share it with the rest of the planet. Mm-hmm. But I do talk about that absurd beliefs like that in this work. So we humans are exceptionally good at cooperating. Unlike any other species, we cooperate. That is our primary adaptation. We are not particularly fast. We are not particularly strong. We're pretty weak, frail, naked apes, right? But that is what allows us to dominate every other life form on this planet, our ability to cooperate. So there is always a risk, though, among species that cooperate, of cheaters on the reciprocal exchange. Cheaters, right? People who are the hunter, who will take a share of the hunt of the game when you bring it back, but when he kills something, he has a secret barbecue out in the bush and doesn't share. The comrade who you risk your life to protect in warfare, but when you're getting attacked, he runs away. That's a risk that human beings really don't like. We find that very threatening. We police our tribe for those who aren't cooperating. We show commitments to the tribe that are hard to fake so that the tribe will trust us. Religions are replete with this. So difficult pilgrimages. Some cultures have scarring rituals, things that if you do these, if you put yourself through these, your sincerity can be assured, right? Because somebody who's wanting to fake commitment to the tribe isn't going to go through all of that, right? Probably not. They'd be less likely to. Well, there's some fascinating new research showing that absurd ideas can be a hard to fake commitment to the tribe. Espousing an idea that gets you ridiculed by outsiders, right? That makes leaving the tribe even difficult. That's the cost. That's the cost to the individual, right? Saying something that's ridiculous, being ridiculed, but I'm showing how far I'm willing to go to my tribe. JFK didn't die in 1990. He's going to be Trump's running mate in the next presidential election. Right. Bill Gates was implanting microchips into the vaccine, things like that, just absurdities like that. The earth is a flat disk. I mean, and a lot of times we hide.
Is it that the more absurd the idea is it, does it make it, I mean, because these are just so far out there. Does that make it more easier? Does that make it easier to sell for some reason? There's the answer. Impious saint.
I don't know that it makes it easier to sell per se, but it does show commitment to the group. It's almost like, getting tribal scarring. It's
I
like,
see what you mean.
I am
Yeah.
showing
So,
my commitment to the group. And if you're willing to do that and do it publicly, you're showing that you're one of us. And we relied on each other so much across our history. We have a fear of not belonging to the group that's profound, and it operates under the radar of our conscious awareness most times. And so, that's because for most of our history, being ejected from the tribe would have been a death sentence. If imagine if we dropped either of you practically naked out on the African savannah by yourself, how long would you live? So we evolved all these psychological mechanisms to prevent that from happening. And going with the group, showing commitment to the group is one of those. And absurd ideas, unfortunately, is one of the ways that we show commitment to the group. And sometimes we convince ourselves of it so that we're more convincing in our sincerity to the group.
Wow. That's an angle that I wasn't expecting whatsoever, because see, when I think about just what I've observed, which I am not a psychologist. I do not have my PhD. But when I think about the people that I've observed who got really deep into QAnon or into just, COVID is a myth, it's a democratic hoax, sort of like the Trumpy talking points and such, those sort of like absurd conspiracy theories. But it seemed to me, especially when you get into that classic New World Order, somebody's pulling the strings, that to me has always seemed like people, just like when dealing with death and this need for an afterlife, they are afraid of this idea that they are not in control or that nobody is in control. So it is somehow more comforting to believe that there are puppet masters pulling the strings, but that they are also smart enough to see this through when nobody else does.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's certainly one stream in that just really unfortunate human behavior to believe stupidities like that. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Does that tie into the idea, though? I'm just piecing this together right here on the fly, so it may be stupid, but does that tie into that? If you feel like there's an alpha god, if you feel like the alpha male, the alpha is in control, are these people feeling out of control and a loss of control? And like Genevieve said, it's easier to believe there's an evil cabal behind something that's controlling things, and it's the master, because I don't feel like I'm the master of my own world anymore. So there must be a master somewhere making bad things happen. Is that part of it?
Well, the thing is, it's very tribalistic. Like these kinds of beliefs don't happen in a vacuum. It's baked into our tribalistic psychology, right? And you rarely hear people, unless they're psychotic, having these theories that's not expressed publicly. And how often do these theories identify an outside enemy, right? The Center for Disease Control, Dr. Fauci, the left, liberal media, for example, the frequency with which those outside enemies are identified really speaks to this. This is about tribalism, belonging to the tribe.
So my friend, and we're going to have her on as a guest in a few weeks, Genevieve and Jean, in June, talking about her family, because she's very open about it, because she feels like, I can't reach them. I've exhausted all efforts to reach them, and I'm going public with this in hopes that they will be embarrassed, or that they will want to engage with me, or that I can help other people who've lost family members to this nonsense. But she's trying to understand how they got there. So in that family's case, now I'm wondering if you would peel back behind the curtains, if you would see some tribalistic behavior, because from all appearances, they're not in that tribe, that typical, you think of conservative evangelicals. By and large, the QAnon tribe is the conservative evangelicals, in my experience. Is that what you would agree with, Hector?
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's always exceptions, and there is some overlap. I mean, there's emerging research to show that the extreme left is more in common with the extreme right.
Yeah.
Those more prone to cancel culture, they match up on all these personological indices with the extreme right. And it's again, it's that tribalistic mindset. So yeah, that can certainly happen in the leftist camp, so to speak. I mean,
that makes sense
yeah.
because to all appearances they don't belong to that tribe, so they're not getting the pressure from the tribal leader to line up with the ideology that you would see. And I mean, I don't even know. I know most of my family, evangelical family, they live in Texas, by the way. Hector, you guys can't get your shit together down there. But most of my family, mom, brothers, sisters, they're evangelical Trumpers. I don't know. I'm even afraid to ask, are they in the QAnon tribe as well? Because that tends to be the group that gravitates toward that, because their tribal leader insists upon that mindset and they need to follow the herd. But to all appearances, my friend's family doesn't seem to fit that mold. They're free thinkers, you would think. They're liberal, they're skeptical, they're all of these things. And yet somehow they bought this stuff. It doesn't make sense. So I'm
Maybe
wondering
they
if
aren't who you thought they were. I mean,
that's a good question. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah,
see
it's
this.
hard to say with individual cases, but in general, I mean, we can look at populations and see trends. And I think I don't think the left is immune to holding
No,
absurd beliefs. They're not immune to tribalism.
they're not immune to dogma, as we see within
They're
our own.
not immune to dogma.
Mhm.
The left is more so, it seems, developing their own set of dogmas that cannot be questioned or challenged.
Exactly, and canceling those who don't agree with them.
Canceling those who don't agree with
That's
them.
what I talked about at the conference a little bit.
Yeah.
Nadim is capturing griftianity. $5 super chat with a comment. I want maybe get Hector's thought on this. Attribution error. Can you put that back up, Ethan? There it is. Attribution error 2. We ascribe ourselves as causes. When something bad happens, we default to finding a cause to it, real or imagined. Thoughts on that, Hector?
Yeah, that's one of many errors. Sure. Yeah, many errors in thinking. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to get back to where we touched on a little bit your early story and where you came from and what formed you, what caused you to go into the field of studying the mind, if you will. You weren't raised a Christian. You were. What's your upbringing like?
Wow, my upbringing is quite a story. I think I have a different early life than most public intellectual professorial types. I grew up on the Texas, New Mexico border in El Paso. It's a border country. It's Southwest. I'm ethnically what's known as mestizo. I'm a third native, and thank you 23andMe for clarifying as 33% native, 66% Spaniard, and that is a legacy of religious conquest that that we saw all around us growing up. My father was atheist mostly because his family was just hellfire and brimstone Catholic. I mean, brutal human beings that he's like, no, this is not for me. So I wasn't raised that way. But, growing up on the border, just a lot of insanity. I mean, El Paso is, and Ciudad Juarez, which is its neighboring city, is the biggest drug transportation hub in the country. So like I got early exposure to everything. I mean, I grew up in the 1980s where the Just Say No campaign was bleeding in the background loudly. I don't know if you remember those. Nancy Reagan and
Just say no, Hector.
But there's so much drugs coming up from El Paso. We did cocaine on our desks in middle school. I mean, we'd go out to the desert and find these huge bales of marijuana that drug runners would come and drop off with their planes and like just forget one. So a lot of craziness there. And I could go across the border and go to a bar. I was 14 years old when I first ordered a drink at a bar. so, you know, and I knew people who were getting killed in the drug trade. I knew people who were going to prison. It's just amazing. I survived that shit. I dropped out of high school. So there was a point in my life where I just felt like, man, I am accelerating towards a wall and there's no stopping this.
How old were you when you thought that way?
Oh, for like a decade.
In your late teens, early 20s?
When I was like 25, I said, I'm going to go back to school. See, I was a smart kid. I skipped a grade. They didn't know what to do with me back on the board. They just skip a grade. So I was like this younger, smaller kid, but ended up dropping out of high school. So finally I start coming back to school and I'm like, this is amazing. I love this. This is great. But I, you know, from all the violence and craziness, I definitely had PTSD. I had it. I would walk around carrying a knife because I thought people were going to attack me. I was looking around my shoulder all the time. I was drinking to like, you know, just self-medicate to bring myself down so I could be in public. And so what happened was that because I was not raised Catholic, that gave me the intellectual freedom to explore the native side of my heritage, which none of my family could do because that was the forbidden side, right? When there is religious conquest, the conquerors decide which side is shameful, right?
They get to control the story, right?
They get to control the story. They get to wash your mouth out with soap if you speak your native language. They give you Christian names. So I remember, so we were talking about the native church when I saw you the other day at the conference, and I remember this really clearly. I made friends with the professors in the department, the anthropology department. They were cool, man. They were bohemian. You could talk to them. I'd have these long conversations with them. Professors in psychology, where I went to undergrad, they were like these stuffy, highly starched white dudes. You know, they didn't play that. But the anthro guys were cool. So I made friends with one professor there named Duncan Earl. Walk into his office, still drunk from the night before. I was making straight A's, but I was like medicating. And he's like, bro, you look like shit. You know, we got to come with me because we talked about my native heritage. So he took me to a Native American church ceremony. And that is it's a tradition that's called church largely as subterfuge. I mean, it's a tradition that came from Mexico that dates back thousands of years that the northern Native American tribes started using as kind of a resistance movement to the Christianity that was being forced upon them. But they called it a church so they could be left alone. It's psychotherapy for 8 hours, right? That's what it is. So you come in, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. You come in and you sit up for 8 hours straight. And there's a fire inside a teepee, and there's an altar there. I told you about this the other night.
Yeah.
We were talking. There's an altar made of sand surrounding the fire, and it looks like a half moon. And the story is, you're told, look, this represents your life cycle. This altar made of sand. It comes from this sand from the earth, just like you do. It grows, and it goes back in, and you're going back in. So you come into this space, and the peyote medicine like amplifies your sensitivity to things in this really powerful way. And you focus on life's temporal nature, and you place yourself on that life cycle, right? Depending on your age, depending on your health. If you're sick, you might be towards the end, and you're there for 8 hours, amplified by this psychedelic, focusing on, okay, what do I want to do now? How do I want to live it? What have I been doing so far? How have I been screwing up?
So that kind of woke you up.
immediately.
Wow.
Amazing. It was amazing. And if I were to just give you peyote and just say, all right, eat that, good luck, you would have a very different experience. You know, you could hurt yourself. But this is a tradition that's everything is controlled. And look, that's not for everybody. That's not for everybody. I'm not saying, you know, if you go show up on a reservation asking for peyote and you're outside the culture, you're going to get a hard rejection. It's not for everybody.
What is exactly peyote?
It's a
What is?
cactus that
Yeah,
has a bunch
I've
of,
heard of it, but I just didn't know what it was.
it has a cactus. The main psychoactive is mescaline, but it has 53 other psychoactive alkaloids.
Mm-hmm.
And you get this profound insight. You get that perspective from above that takes you out of the moment and allows you to focus on, with the ritual, focus on living. And unlike the Christian tradition that says, no, there's an afterlife, don't worry about it, you're going to be singing in the clouds with your dead relatives, it's going to be fine. Like, no, you're going back in. You know, we're made of the earth and you're going back in.
So it's similar to these ayahuasca experiences people are having now that you and I
It
talked about.
is. It
Yeah.
is. And I've done that as well. But that I would not have survived if I didn't wander into there. So I was really embedded for 20 years and I thought a lot about what it means to be human. I thought a lot about what it means to be a member of a tribe, you know, and a lot of my work came out of the realizations I had there.
Really?
So, you know, whether it's, we need to arrive, I think, to live a meaningful life, we need to arrive at that realization somehow, whether it's through the pages of a book, whether it's like an experience like that, or whether it's through deep meditation, whether it's, you know, watching Dave Warnock and thinking, oh shit, you know, life's temporary, you know, it has immense value. And, you know, I think so what I like about that tradition is it's honest about our connection to all their life forms. Like Genevieve was saying, like, you know, it's honest, you know, we're going back in, we're part of a cycle. We just happen to be this configuration of Earth that has consciousness, you know. And now, you know, now researchers are starting to study what these Aboriginal people have been doing, you know, at least 6,000 years, if not more, in the research lab. And there's a study looking at psilocybin and end of life fears, where they give people who have stage 4 cancer psychotherapy, either with psilocybin assist or not, and then measure their end of life fears at the end. The people who had that psychotherapy, it's like the fear of death goes way down, because what these substances do is they do something to your sense of self. They shrink it. And you see a connection with everything else. You see that you can only see that you're part of something bigger when your ego gets shrunk. And that's what it does.
How can we replicate those in the modern world here? How can we, because I would call it a psychological experience, not a spiritual one, but it's something that I think would add value to almost anyone's life experience. What are you thinking, Genevieve? I see you.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking is that I get a little sad when I see people try to use psychedelics as like party drugs, or like think of it as something that you just like do with your friends to have a good time. Because for me, in my experience, it is, I mean, I am an atheist, but it's a deeply spiritual experience for me, not because there's something that is, you know, magical or unexplainable that's happening. There's there's a very real explanation. There's these chemicals that are reacting with my brain, but I know that in my experience, you know, doing psychedelics, if anything, it has highlighted for me the problems that are underneath that I am not ready to face, but I need to, or it highlights how connected we are in this greater cycle, if that makes sense. And now, granted, my experiences are not in a church, in a proper like Indigenous and Aboriginal setting. This is literally me, you know, doing mushrooms in the Texas Hill Country and like meditating beforehand. It's not something that I would recommend for everybody, but I do know that even if it's not classically mystical or magical. It is very much a spiritual experience that I think is very important. If anything, it's that ego death that is so humbling, and you can sort of go forward completely changed. It's really incredible. I'm very excited about the studies that we're doing now, but I'm also kind of, hitting myself over the head because I'm like, why do we need to, we're doing all these studies, but just as you said, Hector, like, people have been doing this for thousands of years, and yet for so long, like, these practices were just persecuted and are still greatly misunderstood.
Yeah, they were persecuted, but there's immense value to them, and I think it's all open for investigation. I mean, we have to, what are the circumstances within those traditions that makes it work? It's the setting, it's the intention, it's the focus, and we need to learn more about it. And to me, I mean, there are some Native people who are like, don't say anything about this, but I honestly. And who knows what my Native grandma is going to say about this. But, honestly, I don't think any culture, ancient or contemporary, has a moral imperative to keep potentially life-saving information to itself. And it's a beautiful way. I mean, it changed the way I saw the world. And I know that at least on the reservation system, it's used to treat alcoholism. And I met so many people who just got their shit together after going into one of these ceremonies. And it's not something that you take lightly, because you sit up for 8 hours straight. You don't talk. It tastes really bad. Some people vomit. You're sitting still. You're there for the long haul.
Yeah.
It's not just like partying. And so if we can, I like the impulse that you were speaking to, Genevieve, about operationalizing. What is that makes that work? And can we make it, like a formula that can help non-Indigenous people too? Can we devise psychotherapies that use these substances? It's an open question that I'm in support of asking because of my own experiences.
Well, it sounds like one of the key ingredients to that experience was the reduction of ego and self, and getting in touch with the commonality and the universe, if you will, and our own place in it. I think studies have shown, you could speak to this more, but I've read a little bit about some of the religious experiences, the spiritual highs, the charismatic evangelical world I lived in was very experiential in terms of what framed the experience. It was about our experiences with a living God. And I think we've learned that those things, those spiritual highs, those experiences we had in church were nothing more than releasing chemicals in our brains. And we've seen that there's no God involved in a worship experience, for instance, or speaking in tongues experience, glossolalia, or whatever it was. It was just chemicals released in my brain that registered that for me. And so I think we know what that is now, if we're looking at it, objectively. But what I'm struck with is the difference between these experiences you guys are describing and the typical evangelical mindset, which puts me at the center of the universe with God. That I'm a very special creature. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And before the universe was made, God formed me in the womb, and the very hairs of my head are numbered. And all of these things point to me being, all that does is build up my ego. It doesn't reduce my ego. It makes me more important, that Jesus died for me. That's the exact opposite of these experiences where I'm reduced and realizing I'm just a small speck in the universe. Right? Am I seeing that clearly?
You are seeing that clearly. I mean, and it's all fear-based. And coming back to this alpha God notion, it runs so deep, you guys. So for example, across species, powerful males kill offspring that's not theirs.
Yeah.
Right. Conversely, powerful males protect their own offspring. right? And so that's why the Bible, along with traditions that across the globe, establish filiation. We are God's children,
Right.
right?
Right.
And one of the main, and it's just something I unpack in the book. One of the main means of establishing paternal certainty, which is important because in order to get protection from the male, you have to be sure that you're his offspring. Otherwise, you're in danger, right? Is by physical resemblance. So Christians have addressed that by developing this idea that we're made in the image of God, imago Dei. We are made in the image of this all-powerful being. This puts us in a category, as you were saying, David, above all other animals on the planet. Including competitor species that could potentially harm us. So this issue of imago Dei leads right into this other concept of man's dominion. We're made in the image of God, and we are rule over all other life forms.
And then, of course, they made Jesus white. So that's a whole thing, too.
That's a whole nother conversation.
That's a whole nother level of QAnon.
Yeah.
But then that also leads us to what we're seeing now, the newest wave of Christian nationalism, which is another form of this alpha God idea that God wants to take over this country and make it all Christian. And if you're not in line with that, if you're not agreeing with that, then you have to go or be converted or die. They don't really care what happens to you. You just have to be one of that tribe, or you're going to get left behind. You're not a real American unless you identify as a Christian. That's the ideology.
Yeah. There are some very dangerous ideologies that are backed by some pretty powerful emotion-driven instincts that we have to learn more about. That's why I talk about this stuff so much, because I think humanity would be better when we understand our darkest impulses, and it takes talking about them. And it first takes acknowledging that we did, evolve by way of natural selection, and we can't, even have a conversation about these impulses before we can establish that. So we have a fight on our hands, but it's a good one, I think.
Well, going back to wrap up your backstory, what was it? So you're saying that the learning about the tribalism in your heritage got you interested in becoming a psychologist and focusing on some of this ideology, which led you to write the books you've been writing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Alpha God was that your first book?
That was my first book. Yeah.
And then you've got two more, or just a second one? You're working on a third?
I've got a second one called Sex, Power, and Partisanship: How Evolutionary Makes Sense of Our Political Divide. I wrote this in the wake of the 2016 election, and I was just appalled and trying to make sense of it. And in the process of writing it and learning what I had to learn, shared that. And then the third one is a bit of a memoir, and who knows, I may never finish writing this thing.
Are you working on it?
I am working on it. I'm working on it. It's coming along, but it's a slow burn, this one. So I think I will release it at some point.
Is it slow because it's more personal than the other was, being more academic?
It is. I mean,
do you find it more difficult to write the personal stuff?
It is more difficult. It's a different writing style, for one. My style is science writing, and I can do that all day long, but it's different writing narrative. And but so far, people tell me some of these stories are interesting. I mean, just having written a memoir yourself, I mean, it's kind of a hard task, because sometimes you're so close to your own stories, you don't realize what's interesting and what's not. And some of the stories I've told people, like, wow, really? That you should tell that. I'm like, okay, So I think part of it's coming to those realizations, right? Getting enough distance from it that you can explain it and share it.
Yeah, I had a good editor. She was really good at telling me, no, Dave, you don't need this. She threw out whole chapters. I mean, yeah. It was
Yeah.
brutal.
Yeah. I imagine, especially when you're writing about yourself, like you're throwing this whole chapter of me away, and it's
Yeah, I took a month to write that. You're just going to throw it away?
yeah.
Well, I for one would love to see Childish Things uncut.
Oh, the uncut version.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got that somewhere. It's yeah, it's long. Well, where can people find your books and what else you've got that you're doing? Tell us more about how to connect with Dr. Hector Garcia.
My books are on Amazon. You can find them there. You can find links to my work on my website, hector-garcia.com, my 2 TED Talks, some of my empirical research and some select conversations that I've had with people on the site, hector-garcia.com.
Okay. Well, you're doing good work, man. I'm glad you had that peyote experience and got you on the straight and narrow.
You are too, brother. You're doing good work.
I appreciate that.
The point is to take whatever I learned and share it, to help people. That's my mission. I can see that's your mission. That's why I wanted to come on and talk to you. You're doing an awesome job.
Well, I appreciate it. That is the key. I think we can't control. I mean, it's a tired cliche, but we can't control the cards we're dealt. That what happens to us in life. We've all had stuff happen. I mean, Genevieve, you got involved in these conversations and became basically an atheist activist because you were in a political campaign in North Carolina and saw the shit show going on around you and said, I can't be quiet. I can't sit back and watch this shit. I have to speak up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what you're doing. You're doing the best you can with what you have. That's what Hector's doing. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, it was that plus losing my dad right after that.
That's right.
That sort of brought it full circle into what am I going to do with this life? And then, of course, a few months later, you walk into it. And my joke has always been, if God exists, then he really, really wants me to get out there and talk about how he doesn't.
The circumstances conspired to do that. But I mean, think about it. You're in your 20s. A lot of people in their 20s are just concerned about building a career and a 401k and starting a family. And those are not bad things in and of themselves. But to give yourself to what, for all intents and purposes is a bigger story, if you will, not just about yourself. That's commendable. And so that's what you're doing, Hector. It's what I'm trying to do. And I think that's what all of us can do with our stories. Find a way to make it not just about me. What can I do and say that can make a difference in the people around me, the ones I come in contact with? We all have a sphere of influence, to use another tired cliche.
Yeah. Well, I kind of wanted to round things off a little bit by something that was kind of in the back of my head, not to lean too heavily into these gendered stereotypes, but we're talking about the alpha god, this like violent, abusive patriarch who makes everything okay in the face of this death that we don't want to go towards. But in my own personal experience, I've noticed that what is much more valuable is sort of a nurturing narrative, letting me know that this is the reality. It doesn't mean that it's ideal. It can be really hard to think that you're not going to have, that the party is going to end sometime. You can't just live forever.
I don't want the party to end. I love the party.
Yeah, but if I sort of conceptualize this sort of working through grief as kind of this like nurturing figure of, yeah, I know it sucks, but it'll be okay. And here is all the beauty that can come from how finite everything is. It's kind of funny to me thinking throughout this conversation that the alpha god, if anything, is damaging, but if we can just be honest and kind and humble in a more feminine light, if you will, it can be much more beneficial to everybody dealing with existential crises.
We just need a female god if we're going to have a god at all.
Well, I would just like to point out that, sometimes you study a slice of humanity that's negative because you that's the best way to answer questions about it. But you know, humanity is so much more complex than that, and so are males. I mean, there are plenty of males who are nurturing, kind, pro-social, loving. You know, and I don't mean to bash, you know, all males, because that's not a full picture either. But yeah, there's a lot more to focus on.
Yeah, that's a good point. This has been a great conversation. I know you've got to go in a minute, Hector. Just to let folks know, next week we've got a show about abortion. We're going to talk about the horrendous anti-abortion laws that are happening all around us, even in your state there, Hector. The week after that, we've got Mandisa Thomas of Black Nonbelievers coming on. And then we've got Hemet Mehta, the Friendly Atheist, coming on after that. So we got some great shows coming up, but none better than this one. This was a great conversation, Hector. It's been so good to talk with you. I think we could have talked all night about some of these things, but we only have an hour and a half, and I know you have to go. So thanks a lot for coming on.
Feelings mutual. Thank you.
And that's our show for tonight, folks.